welcome to the Smithsonian American Art Museum. My name is Chris Shea, and I'm on the board of the James Renwick Alliance. The JRA is a volunteer organization made up of craft collectors, enthusiasts, and artists whose primary mission is to support the Smithsonian American Art Museum's Renwick Gallery of American Craft. The Renwick is currently closed right now for undergoing major renovations, which is what brings us here to the McAvoy Auditorium. And today's event with Michael Janis is part of the JRA's annual Distinguished Artist Series, which each year brings 4 accomplished craft artists from around the country here to Washington to present lectures, demonstrations, and workshops. In this case, we didn't have to bring the artist very far, since we're lucky enough to have Michael Janis live and work among us. A future Distinguished Artist event will be later this month with ceramic sculptor Akio Takamori, and that is May 31st. And yesterday, as the first event of this Distinguished Artist Weekend, Michael treated a group of about 20 of us to an intimate, up-close exploration of some of the techniques that he uses to such phenomenal effect in his work, creating panels of sort of luminous, evocative glass imagery. Participants got to try their hands at some of those techniques, and I think gained an expanded appreciation of Michael's tremendous talent, both as an artist and as a teacher. And I should mention that for those who were there yesterday, Michael has brought the results of your work with him. They'll be available after the lecture. And our host for yesterday's event was the Washington Glass School, which is presided over by Erwin Timmers and Tim Tate, along with Michael, and offers a range of classes in metalwork, sculptural glass techniques, and really offers a really inviting studio environment to work in. So thank you to the Glass School for hosting us yesterday. I'd also like to thank Katie Crooks of the Renwick Gallery for coordinating this lecture today. And Katie's asked me to remind you to, everyone please silence any cell phones or other noise-making devices you have as a courtesy to our speaker and to other audience members. Also, at the end of the program, when Michael takes questions, please speak loudly and clearly so that we can all follow the conversation, particularly so since today's lecture is being webcast. And that will help everyone to hear along. Also, we encourage you before you leave to check out a calendar of events and learn more about the Smithsonian American Art Museum and offerings from the James Renwick Alliance. And if you have any thoughts to share about today's program, fill out a comment card too before you leave. And now I'd like to introduce our distinguished artist. As I mentioned, Michael is one of the principal artists of the Washington Glass Studio, which over the years has become an artistic powerhouse in D.C. and around the country, really. Michael's work is currently appearing in Habitat Gallery's 2014 International Glass Invitational in Royal Oak, Michigan. He regularly shows at SOFA Chicago, represented by Maureen Littleton Gallery, whose Georgetown location just opened a show where you can see Michael's work in person. I really encourage you to check that out. Michael also was recently featured in American Craft magazine as one of a select number of artists in the world creating Sgraffito art glass. The Creative Glass Center of America dubbed him a rising star of the 21st century. In 2011, Michael had a solo show at Fuller Craft Museum in Massachusetts, and in 2012, he was awarded a Fulbright Fellowship by the U.S. Department of State. His work is included in the collection of the Art Institute of Chicago and in numerous private collections. And so please join me in welcoming Michael Janis.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. It's really an honor for me to be at the Smithsonian, so I really want to thank the James Renwick Alliance for making this happen. I'm excited to be here, so if I get all verklempt, just forgive me and let me work through it. This is me working in my studio, and it's the talk I'm going to have is kind of a background of where I came from as an artist and some of the techniques I use in my work, and also some of the inspirations that I have for my work. I was born in Chicago, and right about so that's roughly the middle of the continent, roughly the middle of the century. So I consider myself to be mid-century modern. The family that I grew up in was, my mother was Chinese, Filipino, Spanish. And my father was Greek and German. So I've always had an understanding that there is a diversity of people out there in different backgrounds. And actually, growing up in a very Italian, Polish neighborhood, I always was aware that how one defines oneself is part of one's self-internalization of self. As a kid, I wanted to be an artist. And my parents, when I said I want to do this for college, they said, oh, no, 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 no. So they had accepted, baffled by it, but said, sure, you can be an architect. And they accepted that as a alternate to being what they really wanted me to be, which was to be a doctor. I studied at Chicago's IIT, which was founded by Mies van der Rohe, who was very much Bauhaus. And the Bauhaus had a strong craft and combination with fine art as its background. And I really responded to that. The education program at IIT had a strong emphasis on craft work and that you would have to know materials before you could design anything. So brickwork, you had to know how a brick worked before you could design any kind of archwork or any kind of design that was involving more than patterns and such. So structures, anything else was really based on the idea of God is in the details, and really taught me a sharp focus on how things worked and how things should be put together. As an architect in Chicago, I was able to explore those concepts and ideas, and very much it was all about design and mastering materials and showing how even small areas and small details could be combined to create a whole component of that space. In the late 80s and early 90s, a firm in Australia had been borrowing liberally from my wife's architectural thesis, and she was recruited to go to Australia, and I thought, great, I'll be in the sun, the sand, playing with koalas, dancing with kangaroos, and just on the beach every day. But that wasn't actually the case. A number of projects in Australia that I worked on were featuring design that was a lot more experimental than I was used to in Chicago. And they were very open to focus on using glass as one of my expressive components for the spaces. And I used it very conservatively at first, saying that these are interesting ways that I could use glass within spaces. But since they do have a strong glass background in Australia, I was able to do more and more with it. In Chicago, I had done some architecture, but it was always very staid and almost just stained glass. In Australia, where the spaces were a little bit more open to anything goes in a lot of these places, as long as it could fit within the budget, I was able to start saying that glass was a nice component that would be both visible through and yet define areas with it. One of the projects that I had the most exploration in was for a British consulate in Brisbane, Australia. And I wanted to use the seal of the Great Britain as part of it. And I wanted it in cast glass, reverse painted. I wanted to be able to see through areas and not see through areas all in one piece of glass. That the fabricator said you can't really do all that in one piece of glass, and invited me to come to their studio to see how glass was really formed, so I had a better knowledge of what I could expect glass to do. And after that, I was entranced by glass. I wanted to use glass in every project because now I knew some things about it. My wife, after 9/11, had said if she's going to work for a government, she wants it to be the U.S. government. So we moved back to the United States and focused on going to Washington, D.C. And I said, if I move back to Washington, D.C., I want to change my career. I want to get out of architecture and focus on being a glass artist, which she said, if you think you can do it, sure. So as I moved back to the United States, I was able to change from being the architect into being the artist. I offered myself up at the Washington Glass School to be their shop monkey, and that meant I would do every dirty chore. I would be setting up for every studio class. I would be the assistant to every workshop that they had. And by doing that, I was really able to have access to the equipment, and I was able to really focus my 7 days a week on working with that medium and seeing how that medium worked. And I was happily making bowls and doing other decorative elements, but because it really gave me a background as to how glass works and how you can fire with that glass. And I also had enhanced my education by going to some of the other studios around. I went to Haystack Mountain in Maine. I went to Penland. I went to Urban Glass in New York. And also I just started working more at the Washington Glass School. I became one of the instructors there. And then in 2005, I became one of the co-directors. My earliest forms of glass were an attempt to get away from architecture as much as I could be. And so I worked a lot in kiln cast glass, and I liked the solidness of the glass. I liked the fact that I could shape the glass into forms that could be expressive, but had a different feel to it than what I was used to doing in architecture. And I also liked the idea of doing mixed media. So I used found objects. I used recycled glass because one of the directors of the glass school was very much into environmental issues and recycling, so I just started borrowing that imagery. I would sometimes find images in magic lantern slides, which were these big glass slides that were made at the turn of the last century. And I loved the idea that I could get images in glass, but I was kind of limited because they were only so big, and I was relying on someone else's imagery. So it became a thing of how can I get my images into glass? How can I make my stories and my scale that I wanted to work in? These images are some of the first, actually my first two pieces that I've ever done in Sgraffito. So that was from a workshop that I did in New York with Jeremy Lepisto. When I talk about Sgraffito, I'm talking about using Frit powder to make drawings with. And so I'm going to be working on a light box. I'm going to be sifting crushed glass onto a surface of a flat sheet of glass and moving around with X-Acto blades or clay shapers, the rubber tip pointer, and I can get a lot of detail in it. And then once I have an image, I can fire it in, and I can let the image start saying, how does that whole panel evolve? How can I take it from that point to the next one by working layer by layer? My work started taking on a much more narrative direction within it. And when it's saying that, I like to tell stories within my images. It's not necessarily a linear story or something that's representational, but it's something that I'm trying to create a connection with the viewer, so I'm telling a story where the viewer is the other half of the story. I'm only telling part of it, and I'm counting on whoever sees it to finish that story, because my take on it might be different than your take on it. And I started getting a little bit more architectural in the construction of the glass. I started seeing how things could be boxes, how things could be themes that are explored by using that medium of glass. I wanted to exploit that dimensional quality that glass has, that you're seeing through it, that you're seeing around it, that it's actually a sturdy enough material that it can support itself and become a new shape and a new volume within it. And I also like my artwork to start having a sense of identity, and that could be drawing on my sense of personal identity or cultural background. And I wanted the works to be open enough that weren't specific to me, that they'd be open for interpretation. And I like the idea that I'm playing with light and shadow, and also sometimes going on to the ambiguities of what some of the objects are. I wanted you not to know what the whole story was, but I wanted you to imagine what that story could be. Some of my works, I began also to expand on the scale of them and also what series would mean. And I did a whole series based on tarot card imagery, where I was going to take traditional imagery and make it much more contemporary as to what it could mean today. The piece that's called The Tower there actually had won a New Glass Review. So Corning Museum of Glasses in New York had selected it as one of their selections for the New Glass Review. And though I had done that piece specifically in setting it in Chicago buildings and making the jump much more exuberant because I didn't want any connection to 9/11, the curator, Tina Oldnow of Museum of Glass there, had wrote about how this piece is all about 9/11. And I thought, well, if the museum curator at Corning is talking about it, it is now all about 9/11. In my work, oh, that's a jump. Yeah, it's a little bit faster than I thought. This is how I want to work in my studio. I want to be essentially just illuminating text. I want to be quietly working on my work. This is my dream. But what I really have in my studio is a much more chaotic time. This is a studio that's a very busy studio in Washington, D.C. We have a lot of classes going through. We have a lot of people. It's a benefit to, in the sense that you really can be connected with a lot of people and a lot of activity and a lot of opportunities, but it's also a thing where I have to really think about how am I going to work my schedule and the kiln schedules that are in part of the studio. And I also am not working alone. I have some people who are there all the time. I have people like Tim Tate, who's a fixture in Washington, D.C. arts history, and Erwin Timmers, who's the king of recycling in the Washington, D.C. area. And though I'm joking about them in one sense, they really have been a strong influence in my work. Tim really has pushed people to explore narrative, and really his goal is to elevate glass to be much more conceptual and be much more something that you can say bring it more as a sculptural medium. And that's had been a tremendous influence on how I approach the glass. And Erwin's work in recycling, where he's taking the content and the material and the colors and saying that they all can have underlying themes by the use of that medium, has also been an influence on my work. When I work on my pieces, I'm also working layer by layer that I work separately and then I assemble together and fire into a slab. And so as I do that, each layer advises what the next layer should be. And I work backwards and forwards, seeing how those colors and how patterns would work before I fire it up. One of the pieces that I'm going to take you through is a whole panel from start to finish in terms of concept to finished panel. So I'm often going to start with some rough sketches as to what will be the overall pattern of the piece. And then I'll start working on individual sections, usually starting on what I think will be the central image so I can go backwards and forwards in relation to scale and appropriateness into the imagery. And then after that's all done, I'll be sequencing it up in the kiln to say what's on the very bottom, so it's the farthest back, and what's towards the front, so that would be closer and sharper in detail. And it's a matter of layering it up in the kiln, and I have done times where as I layered it up, I'd have to stop the whole process and take it apart because the pieces just all assembled don't work together. And this is the final piece after it was fired. I'm often asked who is the subject of my pieces, who's posing for these pieces, and who is that? And I've used my wife in my early works as my go-to model. She could pose, she could be happily taking her clothes off and saying, here he is, here's this, and I was good. I said I would disguise who you are so workers don't say, oh, that's your wife naked, and I just started saying there's ways I could disguise it so you're not quite sure whose body is that. And it did work for a good part of the time, but when I started doing male nudes, then someone said, so there's things about Kay we didn't quite know. I also began a strong relationship with the galleries that I worked with, and Maureen Littleton had been very key towards that relationship on how works can be seen within a different context than where I'm working in my studio. That often when you start arranging works, they have to start having dialogues created with other works, how other people see them, and it gave me a lot of advice on how I'm presenting my work and how things are going to be seen by people outside of the myopic glass world, which is only focused on glass. Sometimes with my imagery, I'm also reaching that age where I'm having family members die and leave boxes of photographs. And it's a thing that I felt bad about, that I'm seeing these beautiful images that are almost haunting in their quality, and I began using them as a personal source of imagery for my work as well. So I would say I have no idea who some of these people are because they're unnamed photographs. I have no idea why these people are sitting on donkeys in the middle of the thing, or why we have that, who these people are, but they create a strong sense of storytelling that I feel compelled to use as well. Sometimes the images, when I'm using them, will be a direct translation from one thing to another, where I just want that image. It's a strong image. Sometimes they tell me a story that I feel like I should tell what that story feels like. I had gotten the Fulbright, and that took me to the UK, and it was a wonderful opportunity. Tim Tate had also gotten a Fulbright, and we were able to maneuver this into being 2 Fulbrights at the same time, which they had never done before. And it was a great experience because we were there with a lot of the UK artists, some well-known artists like Jeffrey Sarmiento, who also works with technology and silk screening of Frit powders. So we had a great time there, and we were able to really connect with the artists there. And actually, we're continuing on some of that connection. There is a university from Wales that has been asking Tim and I to do master classes in Wales. But when I was in the UK, I was really taken with their history of print imagery. And since I'm doing something that touches on concepts of prints and how you layer images and how you pull them apart, I wanted to do something that reflected that. And William Morris, not the Billy Morris of glass, but William Morris of prints from the 1860s, had done a lot with printmaking that I wanted to talk about time in my pieces as well, to start including how passages of time could be. So I started using his print patterns as a background to some of my work. And then I wanted a very contemporary face on the surface of it, and then talk about passage of time by constellation charts to go superimpose across them, to create a sense of timelessness between 2 different eras. And I did kind of like that whole concept. I felt that it was really working because I was also looking to branch out and start including more color in my work. I always have a very controlled color palette, but I'm starting to say I can start introducing color. Another artist I worked with said, color is a slippery slide. You're going to go down that slope, and you're just going to keep on saying more and more color. And in fact, she has gone down that slope, and she said, I can't stop now. But I like the addition of color. It's given a sense of work that I still respond to a controlled palette, but I do feel open to including more and more color within my work. Some of my works have also been exploration of perception, of what you see and how you see things and how you interpret those things. So I began exploring different ways to say, how can I affect the way that you as a viewer are seeing this? How can I start maneuvering it to different avenues that you would normally see? And I had done a whole series that was based on anamorphic projections, where you're looking at a distorted image that when you look through another device, the perspective is corrected or the image is brought right. And I really like this kind of series, and I actually worked with the presenter from this morning, the introducer, Chris Shea, had made some of the steel work for that because I wanted a very precise circle pattern that I was not able to achieve in the welding shop. And that's why these pieces also have eyes on them. I wanted them to really be about how you see things and how you perceive things. The way that I had made these was that you would have these distorted images, and when you look in the cylinder sides, you would see them corrected. But I was so happy with that distortion that that was what I wanted to go for. And I began to do distorted images in my work and saying, I'm not going to fix them. They're just going to be exactly like that. And I like that sense of surreal quality that comes through those works. And I began saying, I like that new world that I'm creating with that you really have a greater clarity about your world that you live in if you distort everything in the artwork. And it lets me create a whole new world where I'm in control of what that reality is. And it also gave me a chance to use some of the cowboy imagery from my family that I thought we should start using these stories. In response to some of people who now they perceive my work only on looking at the website, and they'll see JPEGs. And I had a gallery in Washington, D.C. say, so you're not even working in glass anymore, that she only sees a flat image, and that my work might be considered getting a little bit formatted into a regular format. I started saying I need to really start expressing the glass quality to my works. So recently I've been doing a lot more lost wax castings and integrating one different glass type with another glass type to create something that really breaks through the boundaries and starts taking me out-of-the-box type of thing, where I'm going to be actually getting rid of the framework to my pieces and actually saying that I have no easily seen way that I'm mounting it on the wall, letting the glass really read as glass pieces, and letting the elements, again, of architecture start giving me a new context to my pieces. In one of the more recent series I've been doing, I was inspired by Erasmus Darwin, who's Charles Darwin's grandfather. And he wrote about, it's shocking at the time for the 1870s to be saying there's a relationship between plants, sexuality, and people. And it later influenced his grandson, Charles Darwin, but he gave a sense of new world and evolution, which I thought that fits my themes. So I had done a series of pieces where I wanted to have beautiful people and then combining them with cast glass to start obscuring their beauty and saying that there's an element from one world that actually stops you from seeing the next world. And this one is some of the stuff that's on right now at the Habitat show. But I was doing it with lost wax process, and we had to do a lot of lost wax process to do that. And that's where you're going to be making the clay form, putting rubber around it, and making a wax form. This is our studio coordinator. When she realized that, I said I need 100 forms for each. But she worked gamely on in the studio, chugging away at making daily a number of molds, and he'd have to make the wax, pour plaster around it, melt out the wax, and then you're going to be firing those pieces in the kilns to make it individual objects. So I spent almost as much time making the components as I did making the original panels that I'd be mounting them on top of. And it's a labor-intensive process, but to me, to make these stories, I want it to be a very rich pattern. I want it to be a certain lushness to the elements on top. And then I started layering it up after I did color studies as to what those pieces would be. And then I combined them to fit that whole concept of what nature is and what sexuality is in these pieces. And I did them with floral themes, but I played fast and loose with what the colors are because I just wanted to have a strong emphasis of color within my work. And I also really wanted to play on how that sense of perception. I really wanted these to be sculpture panels that were projecting out, that were where I normally work flat. Now I'm actually working much more three-dimensional. Some of my early works had actually resulted in me getting architectural commissions or larger scale commissions. And one of the pieces I had done a few years ago was about 12 inches high. I had the Palomar Hotel in Washington saying, can you make this 6 feet high and 3 feet deep, and we'll pay you a small amount for the same amount as the original piece. And I said, I can do it, but it'll have to change the budget, and we'll also have to incorporate some other elements. And again, I worked with crochet and making the steel work, and then we were able to make a piece that's in the hotel lobby now. And I was lucky enough to have the local issue of The Onion give a review of the artwork, calling the piece the creepiest fucking windows ever, which is an honor. In the glass studio, I thought I'd just point out who my studio mates are. You have myself, Sean Hennessy, Erwin Timmers, Tim Tate, Audrey Wilson, and we work on a number of architectural projects in the studio. And one of our more notable projects was the Library of Congress doors. We had remade the bronze doors that were done in the 1930s and remade them in glass. And it's a long-term project. We've been dealing with them ever since 2004 and different concepts on how it could be. But those 11-foot-high bronze doors no longer met code. They weren't working properly. They were starting to just be a dangerous thing for them that they were compelled to make those changes. So it was a leap of faith by the architect of the Capitol to say we're going to translate the whole imagery into glass. And doing that, it let me get back to being an architect. So I could play the architect hat, and I was doing all sorts of design concepts, bringing through what the different methods would be on how to translate those ideas, all the shop drawings, all the design work, and dealing with the different levels of hierarchy you have to deal with when you're dealing with the architect of the Capitol and the Library of Congress. But it also gave us the opportunity to involve a number of other people in that process. We had gotten some youngsters, and Sean Hennessy was leading the charge on taking molds of the original building. And so we had people from the prop department of the Shakespeare department, Shakespeare Theater. We were also able to, in fact, include some artists from the early studio glass movement. Ray Algren in his studio in Portland, Oregon, was going to do some of the final firings because they had better skills and techniques as to getting a lot of that detail that was required from these panels. We also had done these molds during the hottest part of the year, and I remember Sean was baking in the sun there. But as we worked on the molds we actually were able to get special order glass from Bullseye just to get on the clarity of that piece. Sometimes as you work on these lost wax forms, glass will flop right out easily, and sometimes you'll have to end up chiseling away at the glass and hoping that you're not going to damage it as you go hacking away. But the detail we got from the glass was incredible, and it's a beauty. These pieces also had a separate article written up by American Craft about the work that was done in that. And if you're ever able to go by that Library of Congress Adams building, you should take a look at these doors, especially at night when they act as a lantern and the light comes from the inside to outside. And they were scrutinized. These panels were heavily scrutinized by the architect or the Capitol representatives. They wanted to know exactly what was going in there. And we started worrying that if they start rejecting everything because they were not to their standards, we'd be out of business because the federal government only pays after the whole project's installed and approved. And we brought in one of the art critics, William Warmus, to just give an overview of what his take was on the glass to calm them that they were getting, in fact, state-of-the-art glass work. And after he spoke to them, they felt a lot more calm about what they were getting. When we installed it, it was actually a very nice thing to have the workers all vie for having their pictures taken with the glass panels. And it was a really nice thing to say that there's a directness in the average guy that's installing it wants to be part of that project. And it was an honor to be part of something that's the Library of Congress, which is known throughout the world and is an important institution in the United States. This is actually a side-by-side comparison of one of the bronze panels and how it sits next to the glass panels. And I'm going to say that that's going to be how I'm going to end up the talk about my work.